The Hogwarts letter had been sitting on the kitchen table for 3 days. Harry noticed it every time he passed through. Thick parchment, his name in green ink, the Hogwarts seal unbroken. Molly had placed it there carefully, propped against the sugar bowl where he couldn't miss it. She hadn't said anything about it. Neither had anyone else. He should open it. He knew that. It would contain his book list for 7th year, instructions for term start, maybe a note from McGonagall about his NEWT subjects, standard things, normal things. Except nothing about Hogwarts felt normal anymore, and Harry wasn't sure he knew how to be a student. When the last time he'd walked those corridors, he'd been walking toward his own death. It was late August, and the kitchen was warm with afternoon sun. Molly stood at the counter, sorting through a pile of Ron's old school robes, her wand moving in small, precise flicks as she let out hems and reinforced seams. The domestic magic was almost soundless, just the whisper of thread through fabric, and Molly's occasional, thoughtful hum. Harry stood at the window, tea cooling in his hands, and watched gnomes uproot themselves from the vegetable patch. "Harry dear," Molly said, not looking up from a particularly stubborn collar, "have you thought about packing?" The question was gentle, not pushing, just there. Harry's chest tightened. "I'm not going," he heard himself say. The words came out quieter than he'd intended, but they fell into the kitchen like stones into still water. Molly's hands went very still. The thread stopped moving. For a long moment, the only sound was the old clock ticking on the wall and a gnome cackling somewhere in the garden. Then Molly set down her wand. She turned to look at him properly, her face unreadable in that particular way she had when she was thinking carefully about what to say. Harry braced himself. He'd expected this to be hard. Expected questions, or worse, understanding looks that made him feel like he needed to explain himself. Expected her to say something about opportunities, or his education, or how McGonagall was counting on him. Molly crossed the kitchen and squeezed his shoulder. Once, firmly. "All right," she said. That was all. Harry stared at her. "All right." "All right," Molly repeated. She patted his arm and returned to the robes, picking up her wand as if nothing had shifted. "Would you like shepherd's pie for dinner? I think we've got enough mince." Harry's throat felt tight. Yeah, that'd be, yeah. He couldn't quite believe it had been that simple. That night, Harry slept properly for the first time in months. Not the heavy, potion-dragged sleep he'd managed in the weeks right after the battle. Not the fitful half-consciousness that left him sweating and reaching for his wand at every creak of the house. Actual sleep. The kind where he closed his eyes in darkness and opened them to pale morning light, with no nightmares in between. He lay in Ron's room, his room now, he supposed, or at least the room he'd been staying in since May, and stared at the orange ceiling. The Chudley Cannons posters were sun-faded and peeling at the corners. Ron's old keeper gloves hung on a hook by the wardrobe. The window was open just enough to let in the smell of grass and the distant sound of chickens fussing in their coop. Harry felt the absence of dread like a physical thing. The knot in his chest that had been there since the Hogwarts letter arrived had loosened. Not disappeared, he wasn't fooling himself about that, but definitely loosened. He didn't have to go back. He'd made a choice, and the world hadn't ended. The relief was so sharp, it almost felt like guilt. Ron found out at breakfast. He came down late, hair sticking up at odd angles, and dropped into his chair with the boneless slump of someone not quite awake. Molly slid a plate of eggs and toast in front of him, without comment. Harry was already halfway through his own breakfast, reading a days-old copy of The Prophet, without really taking in the words. "So," Ron said through a mouthful of toast, "what time's the Hogwarts Express on the 1st? I've completely lost track of dates." Harry set down the newspaper. 11 o'clock, Molly said. "Same as always." "Right." Ron swallowed and reached for the jam. "We should probably pack soon. Well, I should pack soon. You're probably already sorted, aren't you? Hermione's been packed for 2 weeks. Got an owl about it." "I'm not going," Harry said. Ron's hand froze halfway to the jam jar. He looked at Harry, then at Molly, then back at Harry. "What do you mean, you're not going?" "I mean, I'm not going back to Hogwarts." Harry tried to keep his voice even. "This year, I'm staying here. If that's all right," he added, glancing at Molly. "Of course it's all right," Molly said firmly. Ron still looked confused. "But it's 7th year, NEWTS and all that." "I know." "And McGonagall said anyone who missed last year could come back without—" "I know, Ron." Ron's ears were going red the way they did when he didn't understand something and didn't know how to ask about it without sounding thick. He stared at his plate, then stabbed a piece of egg with more force than necessary. "Right," he said. "Okay." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. Harry watched Ron eat without tasting his food, the same way Harry had been reading without seeing the words. Molly moved around the kitchen with deliberate normalcy, setting the teapot to boil again, banishing crumbs from the counter. "Are you—" Ron started, then stopped, tried again. "Is it because of— are you—" He couldn't seem to find the end of the question. "I just need a bit of time," Harry said. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. "That's all." Ron nodded slowly. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. That was something Harry had always valued about Ron. He knew when to leave things alone. "Yeah," Ron said finally. "I get that." Harry wasn't sure he did. Harry wasn't sure he did, really. But Ron went back to his breakfast, and the moment passed, and that felt like enough. The days that followed had a strange, unstructured quality. No timetable, no pressure to be anywhere or do anything. Harry helped with things around the burrow because it felt better than sitting still. Weeding the garden, denoming again, fixing a loose board on the porch that had been wobbling since June. Arthur showed him how to use Muggle tools properly, which was both more complicated and more satisfying than Harry had expected. "Measure twice, cut once," Arthur said, demonstrating with a handsaw and a plank that needed replacing on the chicken coop. "That's the Muggle way. Well, it's the sensible way, really, magic or not. But Muggles don't have reparo to fall back on, so they've got to get it right the first time." Harry measured carefully, marked the wood with a pencil, and cut. The saw blade juddered and skipped at first, but Arthur showed him how to hold it steady, how to let the tool do the work. The cut wasn't perfectly straight, but it was close enough. They fitted it into place together, and Arthur hammered in the nails with quick, efficient strikes. "There," Arthur said, standing back to admire their work. "Good as new. Well, good enough, anyway." Harry's hands were sore. There was a blister forming on his thumb where he'd gripped the saw handle. He looked at it and felt something settle in his chest. This was simple, fixable, small. He liked that. Ginny was harder to read. She'd gone back to practicing Quidditch almost immediately after the funerals, flying alone in the orchard behind the burrow, working through drills with a methodical intensity that Harry recognized. He'd done the same thing once, throwing himself into training because it was easier than thinking. He watched her sometimes from the kitchen window. She flew well, better than he remembered, actually. Her keeper's saves were clean and confident, and she moved through the air like she'd been born to it. She didn't ask him to join her, didn't even look toward the house most of the time. It would have been easy to read that as anger or distance or a dozen other things Harry's mind wanted to spiral into. But one evening she came in from practice, broom over her shoulder, and caught him making tea. "Want one?" Harry offered. "Yeah, all right." She leaned against the counter while he poured, her hair wind-blown and her cheeks flushed from flying. They didn't talk, just stood there drinking tea in the quiet kitchen. And when Ginny finished, she rinsed her cup and said, "Good practice today." "Looked like it," Harry said. She nodded and headed upstairs. It wasn't much, but it didn't feel like nothing either. It felt like Ginny was giving him space, not because she didn't care, but because she understood he needed it. That was harder to accept than he'd expected. Harry was used to being the one who fought for people, who insisted and pushed and refused to let go. Being the one who needed space felt uncomfortably vulnerable. Ron tried, in his own way. He'd attempt jokes that didn't quite land, or suggest things they could do. "We could fly, if you want," or fancy a game of chess. And Harry could see the effort behind it. Ron was trying to make things normal again, the way things had been before. Before the war, before the Horcruxes, before everything. But they'd never just been normal, had they? Even at the beginning, at Hogwarts, there'd always been something. A crisis to solve, a danger to face, a problem that needed Harry Potter. Without that, Ron didn't seem to know what to do with him. Harry didn't know what to do with himself. One afternoon they were sitting in the garden, ostensibly denoming, but mostly just sitting, and Ron said suddenly, "Fred would have..." He stopped. The name hung in the air between them, like something physical. Ron's face went carefully blank. He picked up a gnome that had wandered too close and hurled it toward the hedge with more force than necessary. It sailed over the fence with an indignant squeak. Harry wanted to say something. Something meaningful, something comforting, something that acknowledged what Ron had lost and how impossible it was to just keep going when someone that essential was gone. But everything that came to mind sounded hollow, inadequate. "Yeah," Harry said, quietly. It wasn't enough. But Ron's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded without looking at Harry. They sat in silence until Molly called them in for dinner. By the time September arrived, the guilt had settled into something Harry carried with him constantly, but had learned to function around. Guilt for not going back to Hogwarts, guilt for not doing something important with his time, guilt for being here, alive and whole, when so many people weren't. Fred, Remus, Tonks, Colin Creevey, who'd been so young, Lavender Brown, 50 others whose names Harry knew and whose faces he saw when he closed his eyes. But underneath the guilt was something else, something quieter and harder to name. Relief, maybe, or just exhaustion so deep it had settled into his bones. He was tired of fighting, tired of being the person everyone looked to, tired of walking into rooms and seeing hope or expectation or grief in people's faces, all of it directed at him like he was supposed to know what to do with it. At the Burrow, Molly still fussed, but she fussed over everyone equally. Arthur talked to him about Muggle inventions and electrical plugs, genuinely interested in Harry's answers. Ron was just Ron, complicated and awkward and there. Ginny flew her drills and sometimes joined them for dinner and didn't expect Harry to be anything other than present. No one was asking him to save them. No one needed him to be a hero. For the first time since he was 11 years old, Harry could just be. He stood at the kitchen window on the 1st of September, watching the sun set orange and gold over the orchard, and thought about the Hogwarts Express leaving King's Cross. Hermione would be on it, probably already buried in a book. Other seventh years, Dean, Seamus, Ernie Macmillan, heading back to finish what the war had interrupted. Part of Harry wanted to be there, wanted the familiar rhythm of term start, the sorting, the feast, the castle settling into another year. But a larger part of him was grateful to be here, in this warm kitchen with the smell of Molly's cooking and the sound of Arthur's wireless playing quietly in the next room, and no expectations pressing down on him like physical weight. The Hogwarts letter still sat on the table, unopened. Harry picked it up, finally, and tucked it into a drawer. Maybe someday he'd go back. Maybe he'd finish his NEWTs and walk those corridors again and figure out what came next. But not today. Today, he was allowed to rest. The garden, she'd had been listing to one side since the war. Harry had noticed it in May, when he'd first come to stay at the Burrow. But there'd been more urgent things then. Funerals to attend, questions to answer, people who needed to see him alive and whole, even when he didn't feel either of those things. The shed could wait. Everything could wait. But now it was September, and the mornings were getting cooler, and Arthur had mentioned over breakfast that he really ought to fix it before winter. Want help? Harry had offered, and something in Arthur's face had brightened. That'd be wonderful, Harry. I'll dig out the tools. So now, Harry stood in the garden, with a Muggle toolbox at his feet and a carpenter's level in his hands, watching Arthur assess the damage with the careful attention of someone who genuinely enjoyed this sort of thing. Foundations shifted, Arthur said, crouching to peer at the base. We'll need to jack it up, reset the corner posts, make sure everything's square. Again, should take a few hours, maybe a day if we run into complications. We could just use magic, Harry pointed out. Wouldn't that be faster? Arthur looked up at him, and there was something kind in his expression. We could, he agreed, but then we wouldn't really know if it was fixed properly, would we? Just that it looked fixed. Harry thought about that, about the number of times he'd used reparo on things without understanding what had actually been broken. Quick fixes that worked until they didn't. All right, he said. Where do we start? Arthur's smile was genuine. Measure twice, cut once. Let's see what we're working with. The work was slower than Harry had expected, more complicated. They couldn't just wave a wand and have the shed straighten itself. They had to understand why it had shifted, which corner post had rotted, which beam had cracked, where the weight was distributed wrong. Arthur showed him how to use the level, how to read the bubble settling between the lines, how to mark measurements with a pencil and actually trust them. Harry's hands weren't used to this kind of work. He'd done chores at the Dursleys, but that had been different. Gardening and cleaning, tasks designed to keep him busy and out of the way. This was building something, fixing something properly. His palms blistered within the first hour. Arthur noticed him flexing his fingers and offered him dragon-hide gloves, but Harry shook his head. The blisters felt earned somehow. Real. He liked the slight sting when he gripped the hammer, the way his muscles protested when he lifted the corner of the shed so Arthur could slide a new post underneath. "There," Arthur said, checking the level again. "That's got it. See how the bubble sits right in the center now?" Harry looked. The tiny bubble floated perfectly between the two lines, and something in his chest eased. They'd done that. Not magic, just patience and attention and getting it right. "Yeah," Harry said, "I see it." They worked until the sun was high and Molly called them in for lunch. Harry's shirt stuck to his back with sweat, and there was sawdust in his hair. And when he sat down at the kitchen table, his whole body ached in a way that felt satisfying rather than exhausting. Ron looked at him oddly. "You've got—" He gestured at his own hair. Harry brushed sawdust off his shoulder. "We're fixing the shed." "With Muggle tools?" Ron's tone suggested this was somehow more baffling than fighting a basilisk. "Your dad's teaching me," Harry said, and left it at that. Molly set sandwiches in front of them, and Arthur launched into an enthusiastic explanation of load-bearing beams that Ron clearly wasn't following. But Harry listened, and when Arthur asked him to pass the mustard, it felt normal in a way that had nothing to do with magic or destiny or being special. Just a normal lunch. Ordinary. Harry was learning to like ordinary. Ginny flew every afternoon. Harry could hear her from the garden, the whistle of her broom cutting through air, the solid thunk when she blocked a quaffle with the keeper, save she'd been perfecting all summer. Sometimes she'd shout at herself, frustrated when something didn't go right. Sometimes she was silent, just the sound of movement and wind and focused effort. She never asked Harry to join her. At first, he'd thought maybe she was angry with him. They'd barely spoken since the battle, beyond stilted conversations in corridors and one awful attempt at talking that had ended with Ginny saying she needed space and Harry agreeing because he didn't know what else to do. But watching her now, really watching, not just glancing, Harry realized it wasn't anger. Ginny was giving him room to breathe, not pushing, not demanding, not trying to fix him or make him talk about things he couldn't articulate yet. It was a kindness he hadn't known he needed. One afternoon, he was carrying planks of wood to the shed when Ginny's broom suddenly appeared overhead. She hovered there for a moment, hair whipping in the wind she'd created, and looked down at him. "Careful with those," she called. "You're holding them wrong. They'll warp." Harry adjusted his grip. "Like this? Better." She shot off again, already refocusing on her next drill. Harry carried the planks to where Arthur was waiting and tried to ignore the warmth that had settled in his chest. It wasn't much, just a few words, practical and uncomplicated, but it felt like Ginny was still there, even while giving him space, still noticing, still Ginny. That was enough for now. Ron was struggling. Harry could see it in the way Ron moved through the house too carefully, like he was trying not to disturb something. He avoided the workshop where Fred's things were still stored, didn't laugh at the wireless when the jokes were ones Fred would have liked, went quiet whenever someone mentioned Weasley's wizard wheezes. George had gone back to the shop in late August, determined to reopen despite everything. Or maybe because of everything. Harry wasn't sure. But Ron hadn't gone with him, hadn't even visited. They were working on the shed one morning, Harry holding boards steady while Ron hammered, when Ron hit his thumb instead of the nail. "Fuck," Ron hissed, dropping the hammer and shaking his hand. Harry winced in sympathy. "You all right?" "Fine. Just stupid." Ron picked up the hammer again, but his jaw was tight. They worked in silence for a while. Harry could feel Ron's frustration radiating off him like heat, but he didn't know how to address it. How did you ask someone if they were okay when the answer was obviously no? When your own grief felt like it was taking up all the available space? Fred would have enchanted the nails to hammer themselves, Ron said suddenly. His voice was flat, matter of fact. Would have made the whole thing into a joke, had the shed dancing or something stupid. Harry's hands stilled on the board he was holding. Ron kept his eyes on the nail he was lining up. He'd have thought this was mental. All this muggle work when we could just... He gestured vaguely with the hammer. "Fix it properly." "Your dad doesn't think this is mental," Harry said quietly. "No, Dad loves this stuff." Ron finally hit the nail clean, driving it home with 3 solid strikes. "I just don't get the point of it. Why make things harder than they have to be?" Harry thought about the blister on his thumb that had finally started to callus over. About the way Arthur's face looked when they got a corner post, perfectly vertical. About how working with his hands kept his mind from spiraling into darker places. "Maybe it's not about easy or hard," he said. "Maybe it's just something to do. Something that has a clear answer." Ron looked at him then, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Yeah, maybe." They finished the wall in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Less heavy, more like they were both just existing in the same space, not trying to fix anything, not trying to be anything other than 2 people holding up boards and hammering nails. When they broke for lunch, Ron's shoulders seemed less tight. It wasn't much, but it was something. The work on the shed took 3 days. Harry learned how to cut wood in straight lines, how to check if something was level, how to drive nails without bending them. Arthur taught him about grain and stress points, and why certain joints were stronger than others. Most of it went over Harry's head at first, but Arthur was patient, explaining things 2 or 3 times without ever sounding frustrated. "The trick is to work with the wood," Arthur said, running his hand along a beam they'd just fitted. "It wants to be strong. You're just helping it along." Harry thought about that more than he probably should have. On the 3rd day, they finished. The shed stood straight and solid, its door closing properly for the first time in months. Arthur stepped back to admire their work, hands on his hips, looking absurdly pleased. "Well done, Harry. Really well done." Harry looked at the shed, at the corners they'd squared, the posts they'd reset, the roof they'd stabilized, and felt something uncomplicated and good. Pride, maybe, or just satisfaction. They'd fixed it, not with magic, not quickly, but properly. "Thanks for teaching me," Harry said. Arthur clapped him on the shoulder. "Any time. I've got a fence that needs mending next, if you're interested." Harry surprised himself by saying yes. That night, Harry sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching the sky fade from blue to purple through the window. His hands were sore. There were splinters he'd need to dig out later, and his shoulders ached from lifting and holding and hammering. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with fear or fighting or running for his life. Just honest, physical tired. Molly came in from the garden with a basket of late summer vegetables and started laying them out on the counter. She glanced at Harry's hands and made a small sound. "You should put something on those blisters." "They're all right," Harry said. "They'll get infected if you're not careful." But she said it fondly, the way she said most things to her children. She pulled out a small tin of salve from a cupboard and set it in front of him. "Kidney paste. It'll help." Harry opened the tin and spread some of the salve across his palm. It smelled like herbs and felt cool against his skin. Soothing. "You've been working hard," Molly said, washing vegetables in the sink. It wasn't a question. "Feels good to fix things," Harry admitted. Molly smiled at that. "Your parents would be proud of you. You know that, don't you?" Harry's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and focused on his tea. Molly didn't push. She just started chopping carrots with quick, efficient movements, humming under her breath. The kitchen filled with the sound of her work. Knife against cutting board, water running, the occasional clink of dishes. Normal sounds. Home sounds. Harry finished his tea and rinsed the cup without being asked. He helped Molly carry vegetables to the table, and when she started making dinner, he stayed to watch. Not to help, just to be there. Outside, the sky had gone fully dark. Through the window, Harry could see lights on in the workshop. Ron was probably out there, finally working up the courage to sort through Fred's things. Or maybe just sitting with them. Ginny's broom was propped by the back door, ready for tomorrow's practice. Arthur's wireless played softly from the sitting room. Everything was ordinary, small, unheroic. Harry thought about Hogwarts, about students settling into their dormitories, unpacking trunks, comparing schedules, about the castle lighting up against the Scottish night, full of magic and noise and purpose. Part of him missed it, that structure, that certainty of what came next. But here, in this warm kitchen with his hands still aching pleasantly from honest work, Harry felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not permanent peace. He wasn't naive enough to think the guilt and fear wouldn't come back. But peace, for now. For tonight. That felt like enough. Molly hummed as she worked, and Harry stood by the window with salve on his palms, and the shed outside stood straight and solid in the darkness. Fixed. Properly. Just like Arthur had promised. The owl arrived on a Tuesday morning, tapping insistently at the kitchen window until Ron let it in. Hermione's handwriting was precise as always, each letter perfectly formed even on the small square of parchment tied to the owl's leg. Harry watched Ron read it over his shoulder while Molly poured tea. "She's coming to visit," Ron announced, looking pleased. "Says she's got a few days before term starts and wants to see us. Well, see you, mostly," he added, glancing at Harry. "Probably wants to talk you into going back." Harry's stomach tightened, but he just nodded and reached for the marmalade. He'd known this was coming. Hermione had sent letters throughout the summer, chatty ones at first, full of book recommendations and thoughts about their NEWTS, gradually becoming more pointed when Harry didn't respond to hints about returning to Hogwarts. She'd been patient, in her way, but Hermione's patience always had a purpose behind it. When's she arriving? Molly asked. Thursday afternoon. Says she'll flew through if that's all right. Of course it is, Molly said warmly. I'll make up Ginny's room for her. Ron looked at Harry with something that might have been sympathy or warning. Harry couldn't quite tell. Should be nice, though, having her here. Yeah, Harry said, and meant it. He did want to see Hermione. He just wasn't looking forward to the conversation he knew they'd have to have. Hermione arrived precisely when she said she would, stepping out of the fireplace with her hair only slightly mussed and her bag already organized. She hugged Ron first, then Harry, a tight, fierce hug that made Harry's ribs compress. When she pulled back, her eyes were scanning his face with that particular intensity she had, like she was reading him for information. You look well, she said, and it sounded almost like an accusation. I am well, Harry replied. Good, that's good. She brushed soot off her sleeves and looked around the kitchen. Where's everyone else? Dad's at work, Mum's in the garden, Ginny's flying. Ron rattled off. George is at the shop. It's just us, mostly. Perfect. Hermione set her bag down on the table with a solid thunk. I brought some books I thought you might want to look at, Harry, for your NEWT revision. I know we missed a lot of 7th year, but if we organize our study properly... Hermione, Harry interrupted gently. I'm not going back. Her hand stilled on the bag's clasp. What? To Hogwarts. I'm not going back this year. Hermione looked at Ron as if expecting him to contradict this, but Ron just shrugged. He told us a few weeks ago. He's staying here. Staying? Hermione's voice went up slightly. But Harry, you can't just... McGonagall said anyone who missed 7th year could return without penalties. You'd be with our year group. You could take your NEWTs properly, get the qualifications you need for... I know what she said. Harry cut in. He could feel his shoulders tensing. I just don't want to go back right now. Hermione stared at him. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down deliberately, her bag forgotten. Right, okay, let's talk about this. Ron made a noise that might have been a laugh or a groan. I'll go see if Mum needs help with the gnomes. He fled before either of them could stop him. Hermione had brought charts. Of course she had. She spread them across the kitchen table with the systematic precision of someone who'd planned this conversation extensively. Career paths, NEWT requirements, projected timelines for aura training, for magical law enforcement, for half a dozen other professions Harry had never said he wanted. Look, she said, pointing to a particularly complex flowchart. If you finish your 7th year, you could start aura training by next September. You'd be qualified by the time you're 20, which is actually ahead of schedule compared to most candidates. You could do so much good, Harry. Real, lasting good. Harry looked at the charts and felt exhausted. I don't want to be an aura. Hermione blinked. But everyone assumed... I never said I wanted to be an aura, Harry said quietly. I said I wanted to stop Voldemort. That's done now. But your skills, your experience, you'd be perfect for it. And the ministry needs people like you, people who actually care about doing the right thing. Not just... Hermione. Harry rubbed his face. I appreciate this. I do. But I can't think about careers right now. I can't think about what comes next, or what I'm qualified for, or what the ministry needs. I just need... He struggled to find the words. I need to not be useful for a while. Hermione's expression shifted into something complicated. Concern, maybe, mixed with frustration. That doesn't sound like you. Maybe it is now, Harry said. She was quiet for a moment, fingers tracing the edge of one of her charts. What have you been doing then, here? Helping Arthur fix things. The shed, mostly. We're going to start on the fence next week. Fixing things, Hermione repeated. With magic. Muggle tools, actually. Her eyebrows rose. You're spending your time doing manual labor that could be done with a levitation charm. Harry felt a flicker of irritation. It's not a waste of time. I'm learning things. Useful things. I didn't say it was a waste, Hermione said quickly, but her tone suggested she'd been thinking it. Harry, you have so much potential. You could change things, make a real difference in how the magical world operates. Don't you want that? I don't know what I want, Harry admitted. That's the problem. Everyone keeps telling me what I should want, what I should do, what I'm capable of, but no one's asked me what I actually... He stopped, surprised by the edge in his own voice. Hermione looked stricken. I'm not trying to pressure you. Aren't you? The question hung between them. Hermione's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Harry thought she might argue. But then she slumped back in her chair, looking suddenly tired. I just want you to be happy, she said quietly. And I don't understand how staying here, avoiding Hogwarts, avoiding your future, how that makes you happy. I'm not avoiding, Harry said. I'm resting. For how long? I don't know. Hermione gathered up her charts with sharp, precise movements. Fine. That's fine. It's your choice. But her voice suggested it wasn't fine at all. The next 2 days were awkward. Hermione tried. Harry could see her trying. She didn't bring up Hogwarts again, or careers, or NEWTS. Instead, she talked about other things. Books she'd been reading. Her plans to push for better house elf legislation. The state of the Muggle world post-war. Safe topics. Intellectual topics that didn't require Harry to examine his own choices. But there was a distance there that hadn't existed before. Or maybe it had always existed, and Harry was only just noticing it. Ron noticed too. He kept trying to bridge the gap with forced cheerfulness, suggesting activities that all three of them could do together. They played a few games of exploding snap, helped Molly with dinner preparations, sat in the garden while Hermione read, and Ron practiced keeper moves with an old quaffle. Harry mostly just watched. It felt like they were all playing parts in a play none of them had rehearsed properly. Ron as the mediator, Hermione as the concerned friend, Harry as the broken hero who needed fixing. He hated it. On the second evening, Hermione found Harry in the workshop. He'd been helping Ron sort through old Quidditch equipment, or pretending to help, mostly, while Ron worked through his own complicated feelings about being in this space. Can we talk? Hermione asked from the doorway. Ron looked between them, then stood. I'll be inside. He left quickly, and Harry set down the beater's bat he'd been examining. I'm sorry, Hermione said immediately. I know I've been pushy. I just don't understand, Harry. I don't understand why you're giving up. I'm not giving up, Harry said, trying to keep his voice level. I'm just not doing what you think I should be doing. But what are you doing? Hermione's frustration was clear now. You're fixing sheds and avoiding decisions. And what happens next? What happens when Ron and I are gone and you're still here, still hiding? I'm not hiding. Then what are you doing? Harry didn't have an answer. Or rather, he had an answer, but it was one Hermione wouldn't understand. How could he explain that every morning he woke up without nightmares felt like an achievement? That learning to hammer a nail straight felt more meaningful than any career path she could chart out for him? That being ordinary was something he'd never been allowed to be, and he needed to know what that felt like before he could think about being special again. "I'm healing," he said finally. "I know that doesn't look productive to you, but that's what I'm doing." Hermione's eyes were bright. "I understand healing, Harry. I do. But you can heal at Hogwarts. You can heal while also moving forward, while also building something for yourself. You don't have to stop your whole life to—" "My life was stopped," Harry said, and the words came out sharper than he'd intended. "For 7 years, my life was about Voldemort, about Horcruxes and prophecies, and staying alive long enough to die at the right moment. I never got to just be a student. I never got to just exist without that hanging over me. And now it's gone. And you want me to immediately jump into the next thing, the next purpose, the next way to be useful. But I can't. I can't do that yet." Hermione was silent. When she spoke again, her voice was small. "I didn't think about it like that. I know you didn't. She wiped at her eyes. "I just miss you. I miss us, the three of us together, figuring things out. And I'm scared that if we all go in different directions, we'll lose that. We'll lose each other." Harry's anger deflated. "You're not going to lose me, Hermione." "How do you know?" "Because you're my best friend. Both of you are. That doesn't change just because we're not in the same place doing the same things." Hermione nodded, but she didn't look convinced. "When I'm at Hogwarts, and you are here, and Ron's wherever Ron ends up, how do we stay connected?" "Same way we stayed connected during the war," Harry said. "We figure it out." She managed a watery smile. "I suppose we're good at that." "We're excellent at that." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by Ron's old Quidditch gear and Fred's unfinished inventions, and all the weight of things unsaid. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Hermione said finally. "I have to get my books before term starts." "I know. Will you write? Actually write? Not just send one-line responses to my letters?" "I'll try," Harry said honestly. Hermione hugged him then. Not the fierce, possessive hug from when she'd arrived, but something gentler, more accepting. "Take care of yourself," she whispered against his shoulder. "You too." When she pulled back, her expression was complicated. Sad, maybe, but also understanding. Not the full understanding Harry had hoped for, but something closer to it. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're brave, even if I don't understand it. I think what you're doing takes courage." Harry's throat felt tight. "Thanks, Hermione." She nodded and left him there, and Harry heard her footsteps on the stairs as she went to finish packing. The next morning, Hermione left through the flue with promises to write and a final, searching look that Harry couldn't quite interpret. Ron stood next to Harry as they watched her go, hands in his pockets. "That was rough," Ron said after a moment. "Yeah, she means well. I know she does." Ron was quiet for a bit, then said, "For the record, I get it. Why you're staying. I mean, I'm staying too, but that's different. I know what I don't want. You're trying to figure out what you do want." Harry looked at his best friend, surprised. "Yeah, that's exactly it." Ron shrugged. You asked me the other day if I knew what I wanted. I've been thinking about it, and what I want is not to go back to Hogwarts, not to follow some plan that everyone expects, just to help George with the shop when he's ready and figure out the rest later. That's enough for me. You've got more figured out than I do, Harry said. Doubt that. Ron grinned slightly. But we'll both get there eventually. No hurry, right? Right, Harry agreed, and felt something in his chest ease. Hermione's books still sat on the kitchen table, left behind either deliberately or accidentally. Career charts and study guides and all the futures she'd mapped out for him. Harry looked at them for a long moment. Then he gathered them up and put them away in a cupboard. Not thrown away, not rejected, just set aside for when he was ready, if he was ever ready. But that was a problem for another day. September settled over the burrow like a familiar blanket. Cooler mornings, earlier sunsets, the garden starting to fade into autumn colors. Hermione had been gone for a week. The house felt quieter without her energy filling it. Her books scattered across tables, her voice asking questions no one else thought to ask. Harry missed her, but he also felt relieved. The pressure of her expectations had been exhausting in a way he hadn't fully recognized until it was gone. Ron seemed relieved too, though he wouldn't say it. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, the two of them. Mornings helping Arthur with whatever needed fixing, afternoons in the garden or the workshop, evenings sitting with Molly while she knitted and the wireless played softly. Simple days, uncomplicated. Except Ron had started spending time in the workshop alone. Harry noticed it gradually. Ron would disappear after lunch, claiming he needed to organize something or check on something, and wouldn't come back for hours. At first, Harry thought maybe Ron wanted space, wanted time away from Harry's unspoken grief and complicated feelings about everything. But one afternoon, Harry went looking for a spare screwdriver Arthur had mentioned might be in the workshop, and found Ron just standing there, not organizing, not checking anything, just standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by Fred's things, not moving. Harry froze in the doorway. Ron's back was to him, shoulders rigid, hands clenched at his sides. On the workbench in front of him sat a half-finished prototype of something. Harry couldn't tell what it was meant to be, but it had Fred's chaotic genius written all over it. Bits of wire and enchanted springs, a small vial of what might have been Peruvian instant darkness powder, notes in Fred's messy scrawl. Harry should leave. He knew that. This was private. This was Ron's grief, and Harry had no right to intrude, but his feet wouldn't move. "I know you're there," Ron said without turning around. His voice was flat, carefully controlled. "Sorry, I was looking for... It doesn't matter." Harry stepped into the workshop properly. "I can go." "Don't." Ron still didn't turn. "It's fine. It's your workshop too." It wasn't, really. This had always been Fred and George's space, their laboratory, their chaos, their dreams made tangible. But Harry didn't correct him. He moved further into the room, careful not to touch anything, and stood next to Ron, close enough to be present, far enough to not be intrusive. They both looked at the unfinished prototype. "I don't even know what this was supposed to do," Ron said eventually. "Could be anything. A new kind of firework, something for the shop, a prank he was planning." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Harry didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. "George keeps asking me to come help at the shop," Ron continued. Says he needs another set of hands, needs someone who understands how Fred thought. But I can't. He stopped, swallowed hard. I can't stand being there. Everything reminds me of him, and George is trying so hard to keep going, and I can't do it. That's okay, Harry said quietly. Is it? Ron's hands tightened into fists. He's my brother. Both of them were. I should be there. I should be helping George keep Fred's dream alive. But instead, I'm here, hiding, while George does it alone. You're not hiding. Then what am I doing? Ron turned to look at Harry finally, and his eyes were red-rimmed. What are we doing, Harry? You're not going back to Hogwarts. I'm not helping George. We're just existing, fixing sheds and pretending that's enough. Harry felt the accusation like a physical blow. Not because Ron was being cruel. He wasn't. He was being honest, asking the question they'd both been avoiding. I don't know, Harry admitted. I don't know what we're doing. I just know I can't do anything else right now. Ron nodded slowly, looking back at the workbench. Yeah, me neither. They stood in silence. Outside, Harry could hear Ginny's broom cutting through the air, her practice session in full swing. The chickens clucked in their coop. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. Inside the workshop, surrounded by Fred's unfinished projects and abandoned dreams, everything felt heavy. I keep thinking he's going to walk in, Ron said suddenly. Every time I'm in here, part of me expects him to show up with some mental new idea, talking at top speed about how this is going to revolutionize pranking or whatever. And then I remember. His voice broke. And then I remember he's not coming back. Harry's throat felt tight. I know. Do you? Ron looked at him again, and there was something raw in his expression. I mean, I know you lost people too. Loads of people. But you always expected to die, didn't you? You were ready for it. We were ready to lose you. He said it without malice, just stating facts. But Fred was supposed to live. He was supposed to grow old being brilliant and annoying and making terrible jokes. He wasn't supposed to. Ron couldn't finish the sentence. Harry wanted to say something profound. Something that would make this hurt less, that would give meaning to the meaningless loss of Fred Weasley dying at 20 in a war that shouldn't have taken him. But everything that came to mind sounded hollow. No, Harry said instead. He wasn't supposed to die. Ron nodded. Right, yeah. They stood there as the afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across Fred's workbench, his unfinished projects, his handwriting on scraps of parchment. I can't talk about him, Ron said quietly. Not to George, not to Mum, not to anyone. Every time someone brings him up, I freeze. Like if I talk about him, I'll have to admit he's really gone. And I'm not ready for that yet. That's okay too, Harry said. Is it though? Mum keeps trying to. She wants us to share memories, tell stories, keep him alive that way. And I can't. I can't do it without. Ron's voice went rough. Without falling apart. And someone needs to not fall apart. George is barely holding on. Mum cries when she thinks we can't hear. And I need to keep it together. Harry understood that impulse, the need to stay functional, to be strong for everyone else, to swallow your own grief because there wasn't room for it alongside everyone else's pain. You don't have to keep it together for me, Harry said. Ron laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Yeah. What if I don't know how to not keep it together? What if I let it out and it doesn't stop? Then it doesn't stop, Harry said simply. and I'll be here anyway." Ron looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned back to the workbench and very carefully, very deliberately, picked up Fred's unfinished prototype. His hands shook slightly. "This was supposed to be portable swamp in a bottle," he said, voice thick. "See the notes?" Fred wanted to improve on the original swamp from 5th year, make it deployable anywhere, self-sustaining, impossible to remove without the countermeasure he'd developed. He set it down gently. He never finished it. "Maybe George will," Harry offered. "Maybe." Ron touched the edge of the workbench. "Or maybe some things just stay unfinished. Maybe that's okay." They didn't talk after that, just stood together in the workshop, surrounded by Fred's chaotic genius and impossible absence. After a while, Ron said, "We should probably fix that chicken coop. Dad mentioned it's getting loose again." "Yeah, all right." They left the workshop together, closing the door behind them but not locking it. It wasn't an ending, just a pause, an acknowledgement that they'd been there, that they'd seen Fred's things and felt his absence, and that it was too much to process all at once. The chicken coop needed work, and that was something they could actually do. They worked on the coop in near silence. Arthur had left tools and materials out for them. New wire mesh, replacement boards, nails. Simple work, methodical. Harry held boards steady while Ron hammered, their movements coordinated from practice. Ron's face was carefully blank, but his jaw was tight and his eyes were red. Harry didn't comment on it, just kept working, kept the rhythm steady, gave Ron something to focus on besides grief. The chickens complained loudly about the disruption to their home, but they were always complaining about something, so it felt normal. Background noise. "Fred hated chickens," Ron said suddenly. "Said they were evil gits with beady eyes and no loyalty." Harry glanced at him. Ron was staring at the chickens with something that might have been affection or might have been bewilderment. "He tried to enchant one once," Ron continued. "Make it lay golden eggs, like in that Muggle fairy tale Dad told us. Ended up with a chicken that laid eggs that exploded on impact." Mum was furious. He smiled slightly at the memory. Fred thought it was brilliant, wanted to breed them, sell them as pranking supplies. "What happened to it?" Harry asked. Mum made him reverse the charm, but it never quite worked right after that. Laid normal eggs, but they were always slightly warm, like they might explode at any moment. We had to be really gentle with them. Ron's smile faded. "That chicken died years ago. Natural causes." Fred was weirdly sad about it. It was the most Ron had said about Fred since the funeral. Harry kept working, giving Ron space to talk if he wanted to stop if he needed to. "He was going to teach me about the business," Ron said, hammering a nail with more force than necessary. "George too, obviously, but Fred. Fred said I had a good eye for what would sell. Said I understood people better than I thought I did. He drove in another nail. Never got to do that, never got to work with him properly." "You still could," Harry said carefully. "With George. It wouldn't be the same." "No, but it might be something." Ron was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, maybe." They finished reinforcing the wire mesh and stepped back to examine their work. The coop was solid now, secure. The chickens could complain all they wanted, but they'd be safe and warm. Small victories. "Thanks," Ron said, not looking at Harry. "For what?" "For not trying to fix it. For just," Ron gestured vaguely, "being here, listening, not making me talk when I don't want to. but not avoiding it when I do. That's what friends do, Harry said. Ron nodded. Yeah, I suppose it is. They gathered the tools and headed back toward the house. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ginny was still flying, her silhouette dark against the colourful sky. Do you think it gets easier? Ron asked quietly. Missing him? Harry thought about Sirius, about his parents, about Remus and Tonks and Dobby and everyone else he'd lost, about the way grief changed shape over time. Less sharp, maybe, but never truly gone. I think it gets different, he said honestly. Not easier, just different. Ron accepted this with a nod. They walked in comfortable silence back to the house, where Molly was probably starting dinner and Arthur would be home soon from work. The workshop door stayed closed behind them, but somehow it felt less heavy than before. They'd been in there. They'd seen Fred's things. They'd said his name, and the world hadn't ended. That night, after dinner and dishes and everyone settling into their usual evening routines, Harry found Ron sitting on the back steps. He'd brought 2 butterbeers from the kitchen without really thinking about it, handed one to Ron and sat down next to him. They drank in silence, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. I'll visit George next week, Ron said eventually. Not to work, just to, I don't know, see the shop, see him, see if I can stand it. Want company? Nah, I should do this one on my own. Ron took a long drink. But thanks. Anytime. They sat until their butterbeers were empty and the sky was fully dark, and when they went inside, something felt fractionally lighter. Not fixed, not healed, just acknowledged. And for now, that was enough. The preserving jars lined up on the counter like soldiers. Clean, empty, waiting. Harry had been watching Molly work in the kitchen for weeks now, but this was the first time she'd actually invited him to help with something beyond simple tasks, like chopping vegetables or washing dishes. She'd appeared at breakfast with a basket full of plums from the orchard, deep purple and heavy with ripeness, and said, "These need preserving before they go bad. Fancy learning how?" Harry had said yes before really thinking about it. Now he stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, while Molly explained the process with the same patient attention Arthur used when teaching him about wood grain and level bubbles. No magic, she said, setting out a large pot. Well, a bit of magic for sterilizing the jars, but the actual preserving is done the old way. My mother taught me, and her mother taught her. Some things are better done with hands. Harry thought about the blisters that had finally calloused over on his palms. I'm starting to understand that. Molly smiled at him, warm and uncomplicated, and handed him a paring knife. Right then. First, we need to pit these. Cut around the stone, twist gently, and it should come right out. It didn't come right out. The first plum Harry tried ended up mangled, the flesh torn and juice running down his fingers. The stone clung stubbornly to the fruit, refusing to separate cleanly. Here, Molly took the knife and demonstrated, her movements quick and practiced. The plum halves came apart perfectly in her hands, the stone dropping free. It's all in the angle. Try again. Harry tried again. This one was better, not perfect, but better. The stone came out with only minimal damage to the flesh. There you go, Molly said, sounding genuinely pleased. You've got it. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the pile of pitted plums growing slowly. Harry's fingers turned purple with juice. It stained under his nails, seeped into the calluses on his hands. He should probably feel embarrassed about how long this was taking. Molly could do 3 plums in the time it took him to do one. But she didn't seem impatient, just present. Working alongside him like this was exactly where she wanted to be. I used to do this with Arthur when we were first married, Molly said, cutting into the comfortable quiet. Before the children, we'd preserve everything from the garden, fruit, vegetables, anything that would keep. Couldn't afford to waste food then. Still can't really. But it's less about necessity now and more about, she paused, considering, more about continuity, I suppose. Knowing how to do things properly, knowing the work that goes into them. Harry looked at his purple-stained hands. I never learned any of this. The Dursleys never... He stopped, unsure how to explain that while he'd done plenty of cooking at Privet Drive, it had been different. Joyless. Another chore to complete correctly or face consequences. Well, you're learning now, Molly said simply. That's what matters. She said it so matter-of-factly that Harry felt something unknot in his chest. The actual preserving process was more complicated than Harry had expected. Sugar had to be measured precisely. The fruit needed to cook at exactly the right temperature. Hot enough to break down properly, not so hot it burned. Molly showed him how to test if it was ready by dropping a small amount onto a cold plate and watching how it set. See how it wrinkles when you push it, she said, demonstrating. That means it's done. If it's still too liquid, it needs more time. Harry watched carefully, trying to memorize the consistency, the way the preserve moved on the plate. They stood over the pot together, stirring in turns, and Molly told him stories about learning to cook from her mother, about the first meal she'd made for Arthur that had gone disastrously wrong, about teaching Bill and Charlie and Percy and the twins and Ron and Ginny, each of them coming to it differently. Bill patient and methodical, the twins treating it like potion making and experimenting wildly. Ron convinced he couldn't do it until proven otherwise. Ginny's the best of them, actually, Molly said, checking the preserve's consistency. Natural instinct for timing and flavor. She just doesn't enjoy it the way I do, so she doesn't bother much. Harry tried to imagine Ginny in the kitchen, creating something precise and domestic, and found he could picture it easily. She'd be efficient, skilled, impatient with the slowness of it. Fred loved treacle tart, Molly said suddenly, her voice going softer. I made one every year for his birthday. He'd eat half of it in one sitting if I let him, burn his mouth because he couldn't wait for it to cool. She stirred the pot slowly. I made one this year anyway. Out of habit, I suppose. George couldn't eat it. Ron managed one bite before he had to leave the table. I ended up throwing most of it away. Harry's hand stilled on the spoon he'd been about to pick up. I don't know why I'm telling you this, Molly continued. Except, I suppose because you understand. About loss. About how the small things hurt sometimes more than the big ones. Yeah, Harry said quietly. I understand that. Molly looked at him then, really looked, and her eyes were kind. You're a good boy, Harry. You know that, don't you? The words hit harder than they should have. Harry had been called many things: brave, powerful, dangerous, useful, the chosen one. But good? A boy? Like he was just normal, just someone's child deserving of affection without condition. I haven't done anything, Harry said, his voice rough. I'm just here. Yes, Molly agreed. You are, and that's enough. She said it so simply, like it was obvious, like his presence alone had value. Harry had to look away before his eyes could betray him. They filled the jars together. Molly showed him how to ladle the hot preserve carefully, leaving just the right amount of space at the top. How to wipe the rims clean so the lids would seal properly. How to listen for the small pop that meant the vacuum seal had formed. These will last through winter, Molly said, setting the filled jars in neat rows. Longer, if we don't eat them all. We'll have plum preserve on toast, plum tarts, plum sauce for meat. You'll be sick of plums by February. Harry doubted that. There was something satisfying about seeing the jars lined up. Tangible proof of work done, of something created that would last. His hands were sticky with sugar and purple with juice. There was a small burn on his forearm from where he'd leaned too close to the pot. He was sweating from standing over the heat for hours. He felt good. "Thank you for teaching me," Harry said. "Oh, it's my pleasure." Molly began cleaning the pot with efficient movements. "You're a quick learner, patient too. That's important in the kitchen, patience. Magic can speed things up, but it can't replace understanding why you're doing something a certain way." She handed him a damp cloth to wipe down the counter, and they worked together in comfortable rhythm, putting the kitchen back to rights. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said after a moment. "Of course, dear." "Why are you—" He struggled for the right words. "Why are you being so kind to me? Not just letting me stay, but teaching me things, treating me like I'm—" He gestured vaguely, unable to finish. Molly set down the pot she'd been drying and turned to face him. Her expression was puzzled, almost hurt. "Harry," she said gently, "your family. That's not kindness. That's just what it is." "But I'm not," Harry started. "You are," Molly interrupted firmly. "You've been family since you were 11 years old and came here for the first time. Since you saved Ginny from the chamber, since you sent those twins of mine into stitches laughing, since you stood with us through everything, good and bad and terrible." Her eyes were bright. "Blood doesn't make family, Harry. Love does. Choice does. And you chose us. And we chose you. And that's the end of it." Harry's throat was too tight to speak. Molly reached out and cupped his face with one hand, her palm warm, slightly damp from washing dishes. "You don't need to earn this. You don't need to be useful or heroic or anything other than exactly who you are. You're our son as much as any of our children, and nothing you do or don't do will change that." Something in Harry's chest broke open, not painfully, but like a release. Like something that had been held too tight for too long, finally loosening. "I don't know how to—" His voice cracked. "I've never had that before, not really, and I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it," Molly said. "Just accept it. Just let yourself be loved, Harry. That's all." She pulled him into a hug then. Not the fierce, crushing hugs she'd given him after the battle, full of relief and fear and too many emotions to name. This was different, steadier, the kind of hug a mother gave her child just because. Harry hugged her back and let himself believe, just for a moment, that he deserved this. That evening, they had the first of the plum preserve on fresh bread. The whole family gathered around the kitchen table. Arthur back from work. Ron and Ginny cleaned up from whatever they'd been doing all day. George having surprised everyone by stopping by for dinner on his way back from the shop. Molly set out the bread and butter and one jar of the preserve they'd made, still slightly warm. George opened it carefully and spread some on his bread, then paused. "This is good, Mum," he said, and there was surprise in his voice. "Really good." "Harry helped make it," Molly said, beaming at him. Everyone looked at Harry. He felt his face heat. "Just followed instructions," he mumbled. "He did beautifully," Molly insisted. "Natural talent for it." Ron snorted. "Harry? In the kitchen? Next you'll tell me he's learning to knit." "I could learn to knit," Harry said, slightly defensive. "Please don't," Ginny said, but she was smiling. The world isn't ready for Harry Potter's knitting. There was laughter then, genuine, warm laughter that filled the kitchen. George's laugh was quieter than it used to be, missing the harmony of Fred's voice alongside it. But it was there, real. Arthur spread preserve on his own bread and took a bite, then nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, both of you." Harry ate his own bread with preserve and tried to taste it objectively. It was good, sweet, but not too sweet, the fruit flavor clear and strong. He'd helped make this. His purple-stained hands, his careful measurements, his patient stirring, something he'd created that people were enjoying. It was such a small thing. Impossibly small compared to defeating Voldemort or destroying Horcruxes or any of the other monumental tasks his life had held. But sitting at this table, eating bread with preserve he'd made, surrounded by people who loved him without condition, this felt bigger somehow, more real. "I could teach you to make treacle tart next," Molly said, catching his eye. "If you'd like." Harry thought about Molly making Fred's favorite dessert out of habit, about George unable to eat it, about all the ways grief lived in small domestic moments. "I'd like that," he said. Molly's smile was radiant. Later, after dinner was cleared and dishes were done, and everyone had scattered to their own corners of the house, Harry stood at the sink, washing the last of the utensils. His hands were still faintly purple. The burn on his arm stung slightly. He was tired in that pleasant, accomplished way that came from a full day's work. Through the window, he could see the orchard where they'd picked the plums that morning. The trees were starting to turn autumn colors, leaves going gold and red. Soon it would be October, then November, winter. Time kept moving, whether Harry was ready for it or not. But here, in this kitchen with purple-stained hands and jars of preserve cooling on the counter, Harry felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he belonged. Not because he was useful, not because he was the chosen one or the boy who lived or any other title people had given him. Just because he was Harry. And that was enough. Molly had said so. And for the first time in his life, Harry was starting to believe it might be true. He dried his hands on a towel and looked at the preserve jars one more time. Proof of work done, of time spent, of something created with patience and care. Small things, ordinary things, but they mattered anyway. And that, Harry was learning, was the whole point. September faded into October with barely a whisper. The days grew shorter, the air cooler. The garden began its slow retreat into dormancy. Flowers withering, vegetables harvested and stored. The gnomes less active as the temperature dropped. Arthur talked about winterizing the shed they'd fixed, making sure it would hold through snow and ice. Molly started making heartier meals, soups and stews that filled the kitchen with warmth and rich smells. Harry settled into the rhythm of it. Morning chores, afternoon projects, evening meals with the family. simple routines that marked time without urgency. He slept through most nights now. Not every night. Sometimes the nightmares still came, leaving him gasping and reaching for a wand he'd left on the nightstand. But more nights than not, he slept properly, deeply, the kind of sleep that actually restored rather than just passed time. He should feel better. He knew that. He was healing, resting, doing exactly what he'd told Hermione he needed to do. But lately, there was a tension building under his skin that he couldn't quite name. A waiting feeling, like something was coming, or should be coming, or he should be preparing for it to come. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the fence he and Arthur were mending, the new recipe Molly was teaching him, the way Ron had finally visited George at the shop and come back looking lighter than he had in months. But the feeling persisted. It kept Harry awake one night in late September, early October, technically, since he'd heard the clock chime midnight an hour ago. He lay in Ron's room staring at the orange ceiling and listening to Ron's steady breathing from the other bed, and felt anxiety crawling through his chest like something alive. What if this didn't last? What if peace was temporary, just a brief pause before the next crisis? What if he was wasting time he should be using to prepare, to train, to become whoever he needed to be for whatever came next? The thought spiraled until Harry couldn't lie still anymore. He got up carefully, trying not to wake Ron, and pulled on a jumper against the night chill. The house was dark and quiet, just the normal creaks and sighs of an old building, settling. Harry made his way downstairs and out the back door into the cool October night. The orchard was different at night. During the day, it was just trees, familiar, ordinary, part of the burrow's landscape. But at night, with the moon 3/4 full and casting silver light through the branches, it felt like a different place entirely, older, more itself. Harry walked between the trees, his breath misting slightly in the cold air. The apples were heavy on the branches. They'd need harvesting soon, Molly had said. The fruit hung dark and round against the sky, weighing down the limbs. He found himself at the oldest tree, the one Arthur said had been planted by his grandfather. Its trunk was gnarled and thick, its branches spreading wide. Harry sat down against it, feeling the rough bark through his jumper, and let himself think the thoughts he'd been avoiding. What if this doesn't last? The war was over. Voldemort was dead. The Death Eaters were captured or scattered. By every measure, they'd won. Peace should be permanent, or at least long-lasting. But Harry had lived too much of his life waiting for the next disaster to believe in permanent anything. And if peace didn't last, if something else came, some new threat or crisis or war, what then? Would he be ready? Would he remember how to fight after months of learning to hammer nails and preserve plums? Would all this rest, all this healing, turn out to be a luxury he couldn't afford? The anxiety tightened in his chest until breathing felt difficult. He was being selfish. He should be training, studying, preparing. Should be at Hogwarts, finishing his education so he'd have the skills and knowledge he'd need. Should be useful, productive, ready. Instead, he was here, fixing sheds, making jam, sleeping through the night, like none of it mattered. What if I've forgotten how to fight? What if I've gone soft? What if people need me and I'm not ready? The thoughts came faster, sharper, until Harry had to press his palms against his eyes and force himself to breathe slowly. He didn't hear Molly approach. Didn't know she was there until she said, quiet and calm. Couldn't sleep. Harry's head snapped up. Molly stood a few feet away, wrapped in a thick dressing gown, holding 2 mugs of what smelled like tea. She didn't look surprised to find him here, didn't look worried or upset, just present. No, Harry managed. Sorry, did I wake you? I'm a light sleeper these days. Molly came closer and held out one of the mugs. Chamomile. It helps sometimes. Harry took the mug gratefully, wrapping his cold hands around its warmth. Molly settled down next to him against the tree trunk with a small sigh, arranging her dressing gown around her legs. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking tea in the moonlit orchard. Want to tell me what's keeping you awake? Molly asked eventually. Harry stared into his mug. The steam rose in delicate spirals, dissipating into the cold air. He should say he was fine, should deflect, change the subject, keep the anxiety private. But this was Molly, who'd called him family without hesitation, who'd taught him to preserve plums like it mattered, who'd never once asked him to be anything other than exactly who he was. I'm afraid, Harry said quietly. Molly didn't respond immediately, just waited, giving him space to continue if he wanted to. I'm afraid this won't last, Harry continued, the words coming easier now that he'd started. The peace, I mean. I'm afraid something else is coming, some new threat, and I'm here doing nothing while I should be preparing. I should be training, learning, getting ready for whatever's next. But instead, He gestured vaguely. I'm resting. And what if that's a mistake? What if I'm wasting time I can't afford to waste? What if you're not? Molly said gently. Harry looked at her. In the moonlight, her face was soft but serious. What if peace does last? She continued. What if there is no next threat, no next war? What if this is it? Just normal life, stretching out ahead of you, ordinary and safe and sometimes boring. Would you want to look back and realize you'd spent it all preparing for a disaster that never came? But what if it does come? Harry's voice was strained. What if I'm not ready? Then you'll handle it, Molly said simply. The same way you've handled everything else that's been thrown at you. Not because you spent every peaceful moment preparing, but because you're resilient and brave and you have people who love you. She set down her mug and turned to face him properly. Harry, you're not a weapon that needs maintaining. You're a person, a young man who deserves to have a life beyond fighting and preparing to fight. But people need me to be ready, Harry said. They need... What people need, Molly interrupted firmly, is for you to be healthy and whole, not perpetually ready for war. You can't live your entire life braced for the next disaster. Why not? The question came out bitter. That's all my life has ever been, waiting for the next thing, preparing for the next fight. I don't know how to be anything else. Molly's expression softened into something that was almost grief. I know, love. I know that's what you've had to be. But the war is over. You won. You're allowed to put down the weapon now. What if I can't? Harry's voice cracked. What if I pick it back up and I've forgotten how to use it? What if people die because I was too busy learning to make treacle tart to remember how to fight? Then people die, Molly said, and the bluntness of it shocked Harry into silence. Not because of anything you did or didn't do, but because sometimes terrible things happen and they're not your responsibility to prevent. You're not Atlas, Harry. You don't have to hold up the sky. Harry felt tears burning in his eyes. But what if I'm the only one who can? You're not. Molly reached out and took his hand, the one with the faded scar reading, "I must not tell lies," the one that had held a wand through so many battles. There are auras, the ministry, thousands of witches and wizards who can handle whatever comes. It doesn't all rest on you anymore. It never should have, but it especially doesn't now. "I don't know how to believe that," Harry whispered. "I know," Molly said gently. "You've been carrying the weight of the world since you were 11 years old. That doesn't just disappear overnight." "But Harry," she squeezed his hand, "you're allowed to rest, even if it doesn't last forever, especially if it doesn't last forever. You're allowed to sleep through the night and learn to cook and fix sheds and be bored and ordinary and safe. You're allowed to just be Harry for a while." "What if I don't know how to be just Harry?" His voice was raw now. "What if all I know how to be is the person who fights?" "Then you'll learn," Molly said, "the same way you learned everything else. By trying and failing and trying again. By being patient with yourself." She paused. "You've been here for months now, and I've watched you slowly figure out how to exist without a crisis driving you. It hasn't been smooth. I've seen you struggle with it, seen you feel guilty for resting, seen you not know what to do with yourself. But Harry, you're doing it. Every day you wake up and don't have to save anyone. Every night you sleep without nightmares. Every moment you spend just being present. That's you learning how to be just Harry. And you're doing fine." Harry let out a shaky breath. "It doesn't feel like fine." "I know, but it is." Molly released his hand and picked up her mug again. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Harry shook his head. "I see a boy who survived impossible things and is trying very hard to figure out how to live now that the surviving is done. I see someone who's kinder than he gives himself credit for, who works hard at even the smallest tasks, who's learning to accept love like he deserves it. I see my son, Harry, not the chosen one or the boy who lived or any of those other titles. Just my son, trying his best." The tears finally spilled over. Harry tried to wipe them away, embarrassed, but Molly just made a soft sound and pulled him into a hug. "It's all right," she murmured. "You're all right." Harry cried against her shoulder, not the violent, gasping sobs from after the battle, but quieter tears that felt like release, like something he'd been holding too tight finally loosening. Molly just held him, one hand rubbing his back, patient and steady. They sat there for a long time. Eventually, Harry's tears slowed, then stopped. He pulled back, wiping his face with his sleeve, feeling wrung out but somehow lighter. "Sorry," he muttered. "Don't apologize for having feelings," Molly said. "Merlin knows you've earned them." Harry managed a weak laugh. "I got your dressing gown wet. It'll dry." Molly picked up her mug and took a sip of tea, now lukewarm. "Better?" "Yeah," Harry said, and meant it. "Yeah, I think so." They sat in silence for a bit longer, finishing their tea. The orchard rustled softly in a breeze Harry couldn't quite feel. Above them, the apple-heavy branches swayed gently. "I'm scared," Harry admitted quietly. "Not just of what might come, but of this, of being happy, of letting myself rest. Because what if I get used to it? What if I let myself believe I can have this, and then it gets taken away? That's the risk of living," Molly said. "Of loving anything or anyone. It might end. It might be taken away. Nothing is guaranteed." She looked at him with those kind, tired eyes. "But would you rather never have it at all?" Never know what it feels like to be safe and loved and ordinary. Spend your whole life preparing for loss instead of enjoying what you have. Harry thought about that, about the calluses on his hands from honest work, about learning to make preserve, about Ron finally saying Fred's name without his voice breaking, about Ginny flying overhead and sometimes smiling at him, about Arthur's patient teaching and George's quiet laughter and all the small, ordinary moments that had filled these months. Would he trade those away to avoid the fear of losing them? No, he said finally. I wouldn't. Then let yourself have them, Molly said simply, for however long they last. Stop waiting for permission or for some guarantee that it's okay to be happy. Just let yourself have this. It sounded so simple when she said it like that. Harry knew it wouldn't be easy, knew the fear wouldn't just disappear, that he'd probably have more nights like this where the anxiety became too much, knew he'd struggle with guilt and purpose and all the complicated feelings that came with trying to be a person instead of a weapon. But maybe Molly was right. Maybe he didn't have to be perfect at it. Maybe he just had to keep trying. Thank you, Harry said quietly. Molly smiled at him. That's what mothers are for. The word settled into Harry's chest. Mother. Not his mother, because that would always be Lily, but a mother. His mother in the ways that mattered now. The person who saw him struggling and brought him tea, who let him cry without judgment, who told him he was allowed to rest. Come on, Molly said, getting to her feet with a small groan. It's cold out here, and we should both try to get some sleep. I'm teaching you treacle tart tomorrow, remember. You'll need to be well rested for that. Harry stood as well, his legs slightly stiff from sitting. Molly? Yes, dear? I'm glad I stayed. Here, I mean. Instead of going back to Hogwarts. I'm glad I made that choice. Molly's smile was radiant, even in the moonlight. So am I, Harry. So am I. They walked back to the house together, empty mugs in hand, leaving the orchard to its quiet darkness. Harry looked back once. The old apple tree stood solid and patient, its branches heavy with fruit, its trunk gnarled with age. It had weathered countless seasons, growth and harvest, storm and calm, loss and renewal. It was still there, still standing, still doing what it was meant to do, which was simply to exist and bear fruit when the time was right. Harry thought maybe he could learn from that. He slept properly that night. No nightmares, no anxiety spiraling into darkness. Just deep, restful sleep that carried him through to morning. When he woke, sunlight was streaming through the window, and he could smell breakfast cooking downstairs. Ron was already up, his bed empty. The house creaked and settled with the familiar sounds of morning. Voices in the kitchen, the wireless playing softly, chickens fussing in their coop. Normal sounds, safe sounds. Harry lay there for a moment, letting himself feel it. The warmth of blankets, the softness of a real bed in a real home. The knowledge that when he went downstairs, Molly would smile at him and offer him tea. Arthur would ask if he wanted to help with some project. Ron would make some stupid joke, and Ginny might be there or might be flying. But either way, the world would keep turning. No crisis, no immediate danger, just another day. And that was allowed to be enough. Harry got up, got dressed, and headed downstairs. Molly looked up when he entered the kitchen, and her expression softened. Sleep well? She asked. Yeah, Harry said. Really well, actually. Good. She handed him a plate of eggs and toast. Eat up. We've got work to do today." Harry sat down at the table next to Ron, who was reading the Prophet and eating bacon with single-minded focus. Through the window, he could see Arthur in the garden, examining something on the fence they'd repaired. Ordinary morning, ordinary family, ordinary life. Harry took a bite of toast and let himself be grateful for it. The fear hadn't disappeared. The questions about the future were still there, lurking at the edges of his mind. But they felt smaller now, more manageable. He'd rest. He'd learn. He'd let himself have this. And whatever came next, if anything came next, he'd handle it when it arrived. But for now, for today, he was allowed to just be Harry. Molly had said so, and Harry was learning to believe her. October arrived cool and golden. Harry woke early, not from nightmares, just from habit, and lay in bed for a moment, listening to the house wake around him. Ron's breathing had shifted from deep sleep to something lighter. Downstairs, floorboards creaked as someone moved through the kitchen. A chicken complained loudly about something. Normal sounds, morning sounds. Harry got up quietly and pulled on a jumper against the chill. The air had that crisp quality that meant autumn was settling in properly now, summer fully gone. He padded downstairs in bare feet, avoiding the steps that creaked loudest. The kitchen was empty, but the kettle was warm. Someone had made tea recently. Harry filled it again and set it to boil, then stood at the window while he waited. Through the glass, he could see the orchard bathed in early light. The apple trees were heavy with fruit they'd be harvesting soon. Beyond them, Ginny was already up, running through keeper drills with methodical precision. Her broom cut clean lines through the morning air. In the garden, Ron was splitting firewood, getting ready for winter, probably. His movements were steady, practiced. Not the frantic energy of someone trying to outrun grief, just the calm rhythm of work that needed doing. And there, in the shed they'd fixed together, Arthur was tinkering with something, his workshop lantern casting warm light through the small window. Harry's family, going about their morning, each in their own space, doing their own thing, but all here, all present. The kettle whistled softly. Harry made tea the way Molly had taught him, proper loose leaf, steeped for exactly the right amount of time. He'd burned himself on enough cups to finally learn patience. He poured carefully and took a sip, still too hot, and he hissed as it burned his tongue slightly, then smiled. Such an ordinary mistake, such a human thing, impatience with tea, a burned tongue, a rueful smile at his own predictability. Not heroic, not special, just Harry. Somewhere in Scotland, Hogwarts would be waking too. Students rushing to breakfast, comparing homework, complaining about upcoming exams. The castle would be alive with noise and magic and purpose. Hermione would be there, probably already in the library despite the early hour. Dean, Seamus, Neville, all of them finishing the education the war had interrupted. Harry felt the pull of it, that familiar rhythm, that structured certainty of what came next. Classes and homework and Quidditch and common room evenings. Part of him missed it. Part of him always would. But standing here in this quiet kitchen, watching his family through the window, Harry felt something stronger than missing. He felt grateful he'd made this choice. Grateful he'd given himself permission to stop, to rest, to learn how to exist without destiny pressing down on him. Grateful for calloused hands and purple-stained fingers and the smell of Molly's cooking and Arthur's patient teaching and Ron's quiet presence and Ginny's careful distance that somehow felt like kindness, grateful for ordinary mornings and burned tongues and tea made properly. The war was over. He'd survived. And for now, for this moment, that was allowed to be enough. Molly appeared in the doorway, already dressed, her hair pinned up practically. "You're up early," she said, sounding pleased. "Couldn't sleep anymore." Harry held up his mug. "Made tea." "I can see that." Molly moved past him to start breakfast preparations. "Sleep well otherwise?" "Yeah, really well." She smiled at him, warm and uncomplicated, and began pulling out ingredients. Harry watched her work for a moment, then asked, "Need help?" "Always. Can you start on the eggs?" Harry sat down, his tea, and washed his hands. He'd learned how to crack eggs without getting shell in them, how to scramble them to the right consistency, how to cook them without burning. Small skills, practical skills. They worked together in comfortable silence, the kitchen filling with the smell of breakfast. Through the window, Harry saw Ron finish with the firewood and head toward the house. Ginny landed and propped her broom by the door. Arthur emerged from the shed, brushing sawdust off his robes. Everyone converging on the kitchen, drawn by habit and hunger and the simple fact of mourning. This was his life now. Not fighting, not running, not preparing for the next crisis. Just this. Just breakfast with people who loved him. Just ordinary days that stretched out without urgency. And maybe someday he'd go back to Hogwarts. Maybe he'd figure out what came next, what he wanted to do with a future he'd never expected to have. Maybe he'd find purpose beyond surviving. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd stay here, learning to cook and fix things and exist without needing to be special. Either way was okay. He was allowed to figure it out slowly, allowed to rest until he was ready to move forward, allowed to just be Harry for as long as he needed. Molly had told him so, and Harry had finally learned to believe her. Ron came in first, drawn by the smell of food, and dropped into his usual chair with a satisfied groan. "Firewood sorted," he announced. "We should be set for a while." "Good lad," Molly said, setting a plate in front of him. Ginny followed, cheeks flushed from flying. She caught Harry's eye and nodded. Just a small acknowledgement. Nothing heavy, but it felt like connection. Arthur washed up at the sink and joined them at the table, already launching into an explanation of the Muggle radio he'd been trying to repair. Normal morning, normal family. Harry sat down with his own plate, the eggs he'd helped make, toast from bread Molly had baked, jam they'd preserved, together. Small things, ordinary things, but they mattered. They mattered so much. Outside, October sun climbed higher in the sky. The world kept turning, life kept happening. And Harry Potter, not the chosen one, not the boy who lived, just Harry, let himself be part of it. He took another sip of tea, burning his tongue again slightly, and smiled. This was enough. For now, for today, for however long it lasted. This was enough, and that was allowed to be everything.